Good morning to those joining us from the United States, and a warm welcome and good afternoon to our colleagues tuning in from Europe and across the globe. My name is Jörn Fleck, and as the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, I'm delighted to open today's discussion on Europe's evolving approach to China and what this recalibration means for the future of the transatlantic partnership. Today's event marks the launch of a new report by the Atlantic Council, a cooperation between our Global China Hub and the Europe Center, and our co-authors, Valbona Zenelli, a non-resident senior fellow with the Europe Center, and Zoltan Ferher, a non-resident fellow with the Global China Hub. Their analysis examines the geopolitical dynamics shaping Europe's approach to Beijing and argues that the shift could help lay the groundwork for a more coherent and durable transatlantic strategy vis-a-vis China. European-China relations remain strained. I think our audience is well aware. Beijing's rare earth export restrictions, escalating trade disputes, and mounting pressures from China's non-market practices and industrial overcapacity have all heightened tensions and thrown into sharp relief the urgent need for a more coordinated transatlantic response. Overall, the European Commission has sought to move towards a more robust economic security focus at the center of the EU's China policy and the broader conversation on de-risking. And at the same time, I think everyone's well aware that there are very different speeds, dynamics, incentives, and objectives at play between the European Union level on the one hand and among a diverse set of EU countries, something that Valbona's and Zoltan's report explores in great detail, not least through a number of rich country case studies. So I encourage everyone to check out the report. Combined, these developments unfold against a backdrop of shifting global power dynamics. The critical variable is no longer whether the US and Europe see China as a challenge, but whether they can agree on the nature of that challenge and the appropriate policy responses. To help frame how the United States perceives the challenges China poses, we are delighted to be joined today by Congressman John Molinar, Chairman of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. A warm welcome, Congressman. After the Congressman's opening remarks, my colleague and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, Melanie Hart, will moderate a discussion with the co-authors of the report and an excellent lineup of experts. Very much looking forward to that conversation. But first, Congressman Molinar, thank you for your time, and over to you for opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Molinar, the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to speak to you today as you debut your great new report on China's influence in Europe. The work you've done to study this issue will provide tremendous insight into the threats Europe faces from China. In the title of your report, you ask the question, is Europe waking up to the China challenge? From my view, the answer to that would be, Europe may be in the process of waking up, but it's hitting the snooze button when it's already 30 minutes late. Through my work on the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, I know there are concerned parliamentarians across the continent who are worried about China. They know that China is a threat to the sovereignty of their countries, and they're actively working to address those issues. Unfortunately, too many governments in Europe are slow to take these issues head on. I remember when President Macron was talking about how Russia is an existential threat to Europe. And then shortly after that, he was in China trying to do more business with the CCP, even though everyone knows China is the biggest enabler of Russia's military and its war in Ukraine. So there's an unwillingness with some European leaders to draw a hard line and seriously look at how their country's relationship with China leaves their sovereignty vulnerable to the CCP. In particular, there have also been several key issues in the United Kingdom recently. The spy scandal in Parliament and the subsequent failure to prosecute the case could have serious repercussions for the transatlantic relationship between our two countries and for the Five Eyes Alliance. I've asked British government for a briefing on why this case has been dropped. After all, if Britain is not going to prosecute espionage, it will surely be on the receiving end of more PRC interference in its affairs. Even worse, the UK may soon allow China to build a super embassy in the heart of London's financial district. The location of this embassy would be adjacent to sensitive communications cables and jeopardize the flow of information and data throughout the UK. Media in the UK have reported that China has threatened the UK if construction of the embassy is denied. However, the cost of allowing construction to move forward is too great. China is consistently expanding its espionage, cyber, and economic warfare activities around the world, and giving it front door access to a location with sensitive cables would be a disastrous mistake. The UK is also considering a plan to allow a Chinese company to build a massive wind turbine factory. It would defy common sense for UK officials to allow a Chinese company to build this project and gain even more leverage over their country. Chinese companies receive massive state subsidies to act as agents of China's economic ambitions, and approving this project would create greater dependency and vulnerability in the UK's energy supply chain. Of course, the UK isn't the only country facing these challenges. Europe faces threats in critical industries, including automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and many more. However, the biggest threat the transatlantic alliance must face together is China's dominance of rare earths, which is a loaded gun pointed at the global economy. The rules announced last month are still a loaded gun and threaten to give decision makers in Beijing a veto over who gets to participate in the global economy. The top recommendation in your report, like many of your recommendations, is spot on. We must urgently work with our allies to build supply chains for critical minerals and rare earths that remove the mining and processing for these minerals from China's grip. I believe that together we can reduce China's leverage over our economy and build a better future with our common belief in freedom as the foundation of a strong transatlantic alliance against China's authoritarianism and malign influence. Thank you again for having me. I appreciate your continued interest in the work of the Select Committee and congratulate you on the debut of your new report. I look forward to working with you in the months ahead.
Thank you to Congressman Molinar for those introductory remarks, which are quite sobering and focused, but also flag, one of the big questions we'd like to get into today is, to what extent is a common emerging challenge on rare earths and critical minerals opening up some new potential for transatlantic cooperation on common China challenges? So I'll pin that question in the top of our minds. We have congrats first and all to my colleagues Valbona Zanelli and Zoltan Ferrer, who have been doing weeks of interviews and field work across Europe to try to answer or get some clarity on this question of, is Europe waking up to the China challenge, or are people hitting the snooze button, as the congressman just suggested? So I look forward to hearing from them. And I should say thank you to the Smith Richardson Foundation for making that work possible and funding. It's really important that we not sit in our offices, but get out in the field and talk to people and do interviews and do field work. So we appreciate that support. And I also want to say we are open to questions from the audience. So welcome to send those in at askac.org. We have a really terrific panel of 4 fantastic experts today. Really appreciate them joining us. We have Michael Laha, who's dialing in from Germany. He's a senior research fellow at the Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and Technology at DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations. Michael joined DGAP in November 2024 Before that, he worked as a consultant for Sinalytics, a European research-based consultancy focused entirely on China. He also just completed a 2021-22 fellowship at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, or MERICS. And before that, he worked at the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. Michael focuses on China's science and technology policy, the role of China in the transatlantic relationship, and China's governance model. We're really thrilled to have you joining from Germany, which really seems to be kind of a key rudder in the steer of where Europe goes on China policy. We have also with us Jacqueline Ramos, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Jackie was the DAS overseeing policy for Western Europe and the European Union, where she led the most recent U.S.-Europe dialogue on China, so has a lot of rich experience to bring. Before that, she was a senior professional staff member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, focusing on Europe and Russia. Before that, she was a fellow at the Center for New American Security in the Transatlantic Security Program. She's held several positions at the Department of Defense, including as senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, where she also covered Europe, among other issues. She's also served at the National Nuclear Security Administration as a non-proliferation fellow, and has also spent time in industry at Airbus Group, which also has a transatlantic element there. So thank you for joining us, Jackie, and bringing those many perspectives to the table. Zoltan Ferrer is a non-resident fellow in the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council. He consults for various international companies on geostrategy, geopolitical risk, and global affairs. He's currently a visiting scholar at George Washington University's Institute for Security and Conflict Studies and a professorial lecturer at the Department of Political Science. He previously served as a professional diplomat for Hungary for 12 years, working as a foreign policy analyst at the Hungarian embassy here in Washington, D.C., and is Hungary's deputy ambassador and acting ambassador in Turkey. He's taught international relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Summer School, MIT, Tufts, and leading Hungarian universities. And he has his PhD from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And last but not least, we're joined by Valbona Zanelli, who's dialing in from Italy. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. She's also a visiting scholar. She was a visiting scholar from 2023 to 24 at the Minda D. Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. And from 2011 to 2023, she served as a professor of national security studies and chair of strategic engagements at the U.S. Department of Defense George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, where she remains an adjunct professor. Zanelli is also a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She specializes in transatlantic relations, strategic competition, NATO, European enlargement, and the Western Balkans. And her PhD is from the University of Bari in Bologna, Italy. So thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to start out with Jackie, if you don't mind. You were leading the transatlantic engagement on China at the end of the Biden administration and really working hard on the let's do things together, let's have an allied approach to China. Things have shifted under the current administration as things always do, from one administration to the other. But to get us started, can you share where were things when you left government on transatlantic common approach to China, not just in words, but also in actions? To what degree was there convergence? And to what degree did you feel like everyone was hitting the snooze button on the other side of the Atlantic? Over to you, Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Melanie. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's panels, and many congrats on the report rollout. I gave it a quick skim over the weekend. Thanks for letting me take a peek. And I will say that it provides a really good baseline on where I think Europe is and where we left off. And I was very impressed, because Europe is not a monolith, as you know. And I thought a lot of the aspects of the report were what we lived through when we were in government. To answer your question, so when I left government, I thought where we ended up with Europe was Europe was still cautious. We had agreement on that China was no longer a hypothetical challenge. There was a shared understanding that China would use economic leverage as a coercive tool. And there was, a willingness to build tools, to build resiliency, to protect ourselves. To get to that point, though, took a really long time and it took a lot of effort. And this is where, you mentioned the US EU China dialogue, and I can provide some color on that. So we didn't just, try talking to Brussels and declaring victory. We stopped treating Europe as a single entity. So when we came in, that first year, we continued the U.S.-China dialogue, which had actually started under the Undersecretary Pompeo's tenure, and so we had that dialogue twice a year, and it was a mechanism where we felt like we could maybe try to discuss not just shared lessons learned on how both sides were perceiving China, but actually trying to get to more tactical issues like what does economic coercion mean? What does that look like? If we were to dive into export controls, how could we align? What is the US doing? What is the EU thinking? And we also expanded it to include things like counter disinformation, tech protection, investment screening, and looking at critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. So that was one prong. The other prong was that we started the US EU Indo Pacific consultations. Those were launched in 2021. And that was our way of trying to not just talk about China as this economic actor, but highlighting to the EU how China would pose a regional security challenge. In that dialogue, we tried really hard to make sure we included all the relevant stakeholders. We weren't just talking State Department to EAS, we were including the Commission, knowing the role that they play in foreign policy. We were also trying to align our messages in those dialogues with what we were doing at NATO. The United States is a member of NATO. We are not a member of the EU. And so we wanted to make sure that our messaging was in sync in all channels. In addition to that, we quickly discovered that different European countries were moving at different speeds. So as is highlighted in the case studies of the report, similar to what we experienced, I would bucket them into three categories. The countries that are heavily exposed, such as Germany, France, Italy, moving slow, kind of holding back the rest of the EU in some respects when it comes to rapid decision making. Then we had the bucket of the alarmed countries, such as the Baltics, the High North, the Nordics, Poland, those countries that, know what it's like to depend on one single country for things. So they very much compared the China challenge to their experience with Russia. And then finally, the transactional countries. So those are very, very cautious. I would bucket those more of the southern flank countries, Southern Europe. Because we knew that we had countries moving at different speeds, we tried to be very strategic in our bilateral engagements. So we would talk to not just MFA, ministries of foreign affairs, but also ministries of defense, ministries of economics. And I think an important thing to highlight that we often don't talk about is we really resurrected subnational diplomacy. Because what we were discovering as we were talking to capitals is that sometimes they weren't tracking what some of the regional provinces were doing in their own countries when they were cutting deals with China, increasing investment. And us, the United States, for a while, we had kind of slacked off a little bit on subnational diplomacy. And so we really made the effort to bring it back because we were quickly learning, that port authorities were cutting deals with the Chinese, universities were striking up partnerships, whether we're talking about AI, quantum, engineering labs, and then, of course, the industrial investments that were happening in countries, Germany in particular, battery plants, electric vehicle assembly plants, and all of these deals are either cut by, being negotiated by mayors, provincial authorities, port authorities. And oftentimes we would discover that capitals would find out after the fact. So we worked really hard at sending, U.S. interagency teams to have these dialogues with throughout Europe. And to put a plug in, this is why our embassies and consulates are so important throughout Europe. And I know the administration is looking at potentially cutting, but this has been one of the tools that has helped us in the transatlantic relationship really highlight the China challenge and kind of bring the macro down to the micro. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. That's a really terrific level setting. And I like your three buckets a lot. The countries heavily exposed, the alarmed countries, and the transactional countries. That's a really helpful way to think about things. So I'm going to go to Michael next and start with countries heavily exposed. We were just in Berlin together for some conversations on China, and as a China expert who has great hopes for transatlantic alignment on common China challenges, I had a hard time understanding Chancellor Scholz's positioning on the EV tariffs. Clearly Germany was most likely to be hit hard and harmed by China's dumping of EVs, but he refused to back high tariffs. Since then, there's been new leadership in Berlin. I'm also hearing a lot about problems starting to hit the German auto market with slowed sales and things like that. Can you share, Michael, where are things now? Is Germany on China in November 2025 the same place it was in November 2024 or January, when Jackie left office? Where are things? Are the snooze buttons still active, or are people waking up? How can we understand what's happening in Berlin?
Okay, that's a great question, Melanie, and thanks for the invitation and congrats to Valbona and Zoltan on your report launch. Yeah, so the view from Berlin, I think, has changed on China. Basically, Olaf Scholz, the former chancellor under the previous traffic light coalition, was a very convinced open market, global collaboration a type of person. And in this new government, we have two key posts for foreign policy in the hands of the CDU party. So, of course, the Chancellery, Friedrich Merz, and then, of course, the Foreign Affairs Ministry under Johann Wadephul are both CDU party members, which is a traditionally more transatlantically oriented and security oriented party in German politics. I think that's important to recognize. And since they've come into office, I think there's maybe three markers for the change of tone in German relations on China that I'd like to point out. The first one is the executive branch tone. The second one is legislative willingness to take on China. And the third would be also the changing tone in certain industry associations. So the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Johann Wadephul, before traveling to China or planning to travel to China, visited Japan and Indonesia. And on those trips, he gave relatively critical statements of China's behavior in its immediate neighborhood, particularly by saying that China was aggressive towards Taiwan. And so 2.5 weeks ago, or 2 weekends ago, Johann Wadephul was slated to travel to Beijing for his first trip and have a meeting with Wang Yi. And this meeting was canceled last minute. And reportedly, it was because he wasn't given the additional meetings with other members, other high-ranking officials in China. And reading between the lines, it seems like the Chinese were unhappy with his tone on Taiwan. So that's that one change. The second change is that, and this is relatively fresh information, the German parliament, the German Bundestag, is giving it another go to set up an expert commission on de-risking from China. So this was reported over the weekend that an initial draft of a set of about a dozen external experts will hold regular hearings and analyses of Germany's dependence on China and produce recommendations on how to alleviate those. And then the third is that German industry has been traditionally very, very careful in how it communicates publicly about China, and then privately will be relatively or comparatively open and more earnest about the kinds of problems that they're facing. That is beginning to change as well. The German Association for Machine Builders, a very important industry in Germany, published a China position paper earlier this spring, and so did the German Association for Electronics. And both of those papers basically point out things that we've been talking about publicly for some time, which is that German or Western companies are disadvantaged in the market there, and not only just disadvantaged in the market there, they're now being disadvantaged in their home market by overcapacity. So those are three things that I would basically hold on to and say that we're really, really experiencing a gradual shift towards a more security-oriented perspective on China.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to circle back around a little bit about for more on what's driving that shift. But before then, Val, we could go to you. You're based in Italy. And Jackie listed Italy under the that first group of countries that are heavily involved with China and cautious. At the same time, Italy is also part of the Southern Europe, so there might be some split identity there. And you just spent months doing interviews in Italy and elsewhere. What are you seeing? Does your view of, first of all, what's happening in Italy? I was very impressed with how Rome handled the BRI exit. I was in government at the time, and we were watching that very closely just to see what might happen. And I thought they handled that very smoothly. So what's happening these days? How is Rome viewing China? And do you, in any additional color or nuance, how do you think about that Germany, France, Italy, and other parts of Europe divides on China? Over to you, Val.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you to Jackie and Michael for the very good comments. Also, thank you for reading our report. And I think, you're really spot on. And some of the recommendations, and also some of the findings from our report with Zoltan go exactly in the line that you just explained. I'll start with Italy, saying that really Italy's China's policy has shifted from Belt and Road initial optimism that we had seen in Italy 4 or 5 years ago with the Conte government to they were looking at economic benefits to more pragmatic and closer alignment that Italy has in terms of transatlantic policy in line with the United States, but also very much in line with the European Commission. And we have seen that mostly it started with the Draghi government. Actually, it had started towards the end of the second Conte government. There was not much out there in terms of the media reporting, but it had already seen that there was no advantages, really. Trade deficits with China were increasing. And then with the Draghi government and finally with Meloni, that has, really, I think that Italy is blending the Atlanticist loyalty with economic caution. Actually, that's what currently, in the playbook. I believe that Italy is less ideological than some of the tough language that we see from the European Commission, and is trying to be very careful because wants to leave some doors open since China still remains a very important trading partner for Italian exports. So I'd like to remind that also Italy, it's kind of going back to the strategic partnership that they had signed back in 2004 during the Berlusconi government. That was kind of, not very much in the media. So not a member of the Belt and Road Initiative anymore, done very, very well, very diplomatically with no big repercussions on Italy. But now it's trying to be more pragmatic on the economic perspective with China. However, we have to say that it's been, has strengthened investment screenings very much. It's one of the strongest investment screening mechanisms that we see in Europe with the Golden Powers, has blocked Chinese acquisitions. Some of those have been really very big in the media, created, confusion even in the Italian, business community. But it's still, as I mentioned, is avoiding the confrontational rhetoric when it comes to the exit from Belt and Road Initiative. But then more broadly, as both Jackie and Michael were mentioning the 3 points, we have listed those 3 also also when we look at differences that exist inside Europe. And I think, we still have ambiguity in the European Union, and it's multi-layered, this ambiguity. It's complex decision making, although the European Commission is trying to be really very tough on China. However, we have national governments that have divergent interests. And so that makes coherence inside the European Union very, very much difficult. And I'll just bring one example. We all talk about the EU-China strategic outlook that was published in March 2019, where we have the tripect of partner, competitor, and rival, which in reality, they cannot even be in the same sentence because it does not make much sense. However, it really shows that there was something for everyone in the European Union. But what's important to mention is that the European Council did not adopt such report, such language until 3 years after. So that shows the differences between the Commission, the member states, and also the European Council. So we divided in our report, actually, we kind of divided the different national approaches that depend, and as Jackie mentioned, on the depth of the relationships that countries, economic relationships that countries have with China, on the scale of economic and technological dependencies that they have, tensions inside between business community. Michael mentioned that Germany is the perfect case example for that. But then also what's important, it's the leadership attitudes that also drive the public attitudes towards China. And that's why I mentioned, Prime Minister Meloni, because she was strong in her narrative, also in looking at having a very cohesive policy with the European Union and the United States. So I think this will be, my starting points. And again, thank you very much for organizing this session.
Thank you, Val. That's incredibly helpful, and just really underscores how, as someone sitting in Washington, we think that U.S. policy is complex with all of the interests that we have here. But really on China, at most, we have two views. And 90% of Washington sits in one camp and maybe 10% in the other. So at least in terms of having a common view, it's not as hard as in Europe where you have, over 20 member states and Brussels. So thank you for, highlighting some of that complexity. Zoltan, over to you. You've been tracking European views and doing field research in Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. To what degree do you see a divide in views on China between Western Europe and the Central and Eastern European countries? Hungary is a unique case. What are the big lessons learned from the engagements that you've had? And how does that add yet more complexity for Brussels? And then just another question to really load you up with questions. To what extent, I've sometimes found that Eastern Europe is really, Jackie mentioned, they know what dependence looks like. They had that with Russia. They don't want that with China. And so they sometimes are really driving the conversation in Brussels faster than Western Europe might be prepared for. What can you share from your own engagements and travel in that region?
Well, thank you, Melanie, for hosting and for that question. And thank you to the Global China Hub and the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council for their support to Dr. Zanelli and myself on this project. Great to be on this terrific panel of outstanding experts. And this question is, been really interesting to look at. What is Eastern Europe doing? What are the differences between East and West? What are the dependencies on the East? So we have found that there are some regional trends and differences between the Eastern side and the Western side of the EU. Our report looked at EU policy at the EU level and at the national level in three domains: trade and investment, technology and security. And spoiler alert, our report has found that overall there's a shift, not a fast shift, but there is a shift from engagement towards balancing and de-risking across the European Union. in most of the national policies and also definitely at the EU level. So in trade and investment, which was our first domain, the reasons for the differences that we found are twofold. The first reason is economic. So Western European economies, and we include some of the Nordic countries, some of the Southern European countries, definitely Italy, in this camp. These Western European economies are on average larger than Eastern Europeans. They also had a longer period when they were pursuing engagement with China, and many of these Western European governments built much deeper dependencies on China during the decades of engagement. The historical reason, the second reason is historical. The historical reason is that Eastern European member states had last to lose in economic ties, but also they've had a more loaded history with communism in the form of the Soviet Union. So our conclusion on trade and investment is that it has been harder and slower for Western European economies to start loosening their relationships with China and start loosening their dependencies, whereas most East European states, so Central and Eastern Europe and Baltics, had less to lose in economic ties and more to lose in risks when they began de-risking from Beijing. So they have been quicker in making the shift, even if their de-risking efforts have been rather uneven, we have to add. So in terms of our second domain and the third domain, which are quite related, technology and security, we have found that Russia's aggression against Ukraine and China's support for Russia's war effort have really had a significant impact on all of the EU, most member states, in terms of shifting EU strategies away from engagement and towards balancing against China. But we've also found that these factors had deeper and faster effects on the eastern part of the EU for some of the reasons that I already mentioned, which is a geographic reason and the historical reason that I alluded to. The geographic reason is they're closer to the war, they're closer to Russia. So they feel the threat from Russia's war on Ukraine and China's support for that very war much closer to themselves. Also, and that's the historical reason why there's differences on China policies in the security and technology domain between East and West, is the Eastern countries, Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltics, they are the countries that broke free of communism only 35 years ago. So they have both geographical and historical sensitivities that make them much more clear-eyed about both Russia's and China's threats. However, we do have an outlier there. All of these things that I said about, the eastern side of the EU are not really true of one country, and that's my own country, Hungary. Hungary seems to be a complete outlier both in Central and Eastern Europe and also within the EU, because the Orban government in the past little over a decade has built a Russia and China-oriented foreign policy and grand strategy. And they've also made their dependencies on China and Russia not smaller, but greater since the war on Ukraine starting in February 2022. So I want to emphasize that part. What we found, Dr. Zanelli and I, is that Russia's aggression against Ukraine and China's support for Russia's war effort have really shifted the overall attitudes within the European Union on China, not just Russia, towards a tougher approach toward China. But Hungary is an outlier in that sense, which has made its own dependencies on China and Russia and its relationship, with China and Russia, not looser, but actually much deeper and greater since the Russian aggression on Ukraine started in February 2022.
So thank you for that. Jackie, I'd like to go back to you. We're hearing from Michael, Val, and Zoltan. They're all talking about indications of a shift that's underway. Sounds like it looks different from country to country, but that it's all a shift in the same direction of more concern, caution, assertiveness, whatever you want to call it, toward China. Sounds like there are many different factors at play there. From your perspective, if we want something that looks like transatlantic collaboration on China, we really need shifts and coordination to be not just in rhetoric and language, but also in action. I have heard some European counterparts say, but it looked so great and sounded so great during the previous administration. Okay, yes, but sometimes we have to do a divide between language and messaging and then concrete action and whether that's aligned. How do you assess where things are now? What are you looking for? Are there any particular actions or metrics that to you, if you see those, you would say, okay, we're in a new paradigm and something really interesting might be happening versus, somebody's just leaning a little bit more towards one of those three pillars in the European approach to China, competitor, collaborator, rival. Over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for that. So just really quickly, I wanted to touch on before answering your question. I very much agree that China's support to Russia enabling the war in Ukraine really was a turning point. We saw in our diplomacy and our engagement that really was a point that helped turn the tide. Other points that really helped were the coercion against Lithuania, right? Rare earth restrictions, and then just like the retaliatory investigations against European firms. All of those, like on a chart, were high points that we saw that there created some sort of turning points in how different parts of Europe perceive China. Given that, though, yes, when I left, all European countries were moving at different speeds, and it was a little frustrating. And so some of the metrics that we look for, and yes, we may have been nice about it, but behind the scenes we were definitely having candid exchanges and hammering away some of the things and some of the changes that we would have welcomed and we wanted to see, not because we were trying to bully, because we know that Europe will never answer to finger wagging, but more for all of us to be on the same page to tackle this challenge, because that's the only way we're going to be able to be successful if there's transatlantic unity. We might not have the same exact recipe, but we should have at least the same contours. And so some of the metrics that I'm looking for are, I know easier said than done and difficult to implement, but is there some degree of economic pain that certain countries, specifically Germany comes to mind, is willing to bear in order to hold China accountable? Yes, at the EU level, there have been mechanisms that have been created, but at national levels, are they being enforced, right? I'm talking about export controls, investment screening, are deals being blocked, are things really being looked at a microscope level? I know Italy has done a good job, but what about the rest of the Western European countries? I'm talking about Spain, I'm talking about Portugal. On supply chains, are companies literally moving, like brick and mortar, our factories, plants moving? Is there relocation? Are they seeking joint ventures really outside of China? I welcome the visits to other countries, but I want to see like the actual tangible outcomes of those things. And then finally, I mentioned this before, at the subnational level, right? Are national strategies taking into account what's happening locally in certain provinces, in certain regions? And I know none of this is necessarily easy. We have our own challenges in the United States too, right? But I want to see more connectivity between what's happening at the national level and locally, because that will really send a message to the United States. Hey, we've thought about this, not just at the EU level, but at the national level and locally. And here's what the strides that we're willing to make and the changes that we are making in order to lessen our dependency on China.
That's incredibly helpful. I like your metrics. The are nations willing to bear economic pain is a really important one, and that's the conversation we keep having in Washington. If you whine about supply chain dependence, but you're not willing to pay to develop projects elsewhere, you should probably just, find something else to do, I think sometimes.
Yes,
Right? I mean, it costs money, and we have to be honest
right.
about that fact. Yeah.
We do.
Nobody's
We
serious
do.
if they're not willing to make the investments. Val, over to you. You spend a lot of time working on the security side, and I know you do a lot of work with NATO, and a lot of the metrics that Jackie just went through are in the economic domain. And I agree. I think I see the most movement in action as being most likely on the economic side. At the same time, there's a land war on the European continent in which China is playing a role with Russia behind the scenes. To what degree if we all agree that Europe is leaning towards something that's a more assertive China policy, is it only economic, or should we see security as part of that? And if so, is it just Russia? Is it Asia Pacific security? Is it Taiwan? Can you share how security shows up?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Melanie. I believe that the security domain has been the domain where there was more in the past few years, more asymmetric interests between the United States and the European Union. So we have areas of convergence, more convergence, so some areas of less convergence, or some areas of divergence. But really, what we have seen, the security perspective has been very asymmetric, and we have seen that many, just only few European countries now really have a China strategy or have an Indo-Pacific strategy. So I believe that even in the perceptions not only of the public but also politicians, I think it's even when we talk about security, they think still about economics and trade. So they look from the lens of the economic security perspective. That's how I see that in the European Union. Jackie mentioned really that the decisive rupture of the European Union with China was really Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the declaration of the No Limits Partnership. So that was the decisive rupture. A couple of others that really brought some consensus in the European Union. I think it started with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it really exposed dependencies that we're seeing nowadays, but that was the first exposure. And also a lot of criticism that was started being produced in Europe regarding the mass diplomacy, but also the disinformation campaigns that enters into the security domain, if you want. And then the second point, which is very important, was the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and also the violent crackdown in Hong Kong, which highlighted, I would say, for the European Union, the values-based concerns. And in that perspective, I'd like to mention the important role of the European Parliament. The European Parliament is not a decision-making when it comes to the China policy. However, we have seen that it has been the institution inside European Union that really has been the moral compass, if you want to say, of issues related to China, raising issues regarding human rights, but also freezing the comprehensive agreement on investment. And so I think that from that moment on, we have started seeing, since 2021 and the different retaliatory measures against European politicians and institutions from Beijing in Europe, we have started seeing a development of the security perspective when it comes to China, but not traditional. I still think that it's not well understood as real traditional. It's related mainly to economic security. And just one quick point is that we're talking about, Jackie was talking about, will countries feel the economic pain? I believe that, if we were to write the report again in 6 months, a similar one, we might even come, with different conclusions. Because what we are seeing now, we have a huge overcapacity, and the trade deficit between the European Union and China is going to increase of more than 100 billion just in 2025, going from 300 and something, it will go around $430 billion. So we're seeing even more dependencies. And the problem is that all those sectors that the European Union needs to develop its competitiveness and more independence from China, those are the sectors that even depend more on China when it comes to rare earth and critical minerals.
Thank you. Jackie had a comment, so over to Jackie.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly piggyback on the security and NATO context. So looking back, that's the lane where I feel like there was much more aggressive action and actually like tangible outcomes that the Europeans did, right? We saw the UK send their carrier strike group. Germany sent a frigate for the first time, did a deployment in the region. And then France expanded its overall Indo-Pacific presence. And I felt like through the NATO channel, we were able, and through downgrading and sharing intel, we were able to demonstrate and show to Europe how China's footprint in the Indo-Pacific region affects how it is linked to Europe's economic security at home. And though that lane of work in cooperation, that is actually another one that I'm concerned about, not necessarily in the Europe context, but in the US context, as the Trump administration continuously encourages Europe to focus on Europe and its own backyard. And, you know, there's two theaters and the theaters are merging. And so I think that work should continue.
That's a great point. Michael, over to you. We have a question from the audience that is, how did the Trump or how did the Trump-Xi summit impact views in Europe toward both China and the United States? And I'd like to add to that the rare earth element, because throughout 2025, it seems to me that China has used rare earths as a lever to put pressure on the United States, but did so globally. It was a global rollout of those restrictions. And I've been intrigued to see my European counterparts say that was against us as much as it was against the United States, and to be clearly very deeply unnerved by the way that China has demonstrated how it's willing to use rare earth, its rare earth dominance for coercive purposes. Can you share? 2025 has just been a really busy year between all of the Trump and Xi engagements and the most recent summit, and how critical minerals, rare earths has played out through that. How much of that is impacting European views, and both towards China and the possibility of something that looks like collaboration with the US?
Yeah, I think Melanie, you laid it out already really well. I think all of this is really a major game changer for how Europe views its own relationship with China, but also the relationship between Washington and Beijing. I mean, what basically happened is that there was an application of multiple chokeholds from the Chinese side on various parts of German industry. Not only did we have rare earths, which were imposed in April and then expanded in October to include end user controls. Those were specifically aimed at making it difficult for Europe to rearm at a time when it was urgently needing to rearm. And then we had controls on more finished products like magnets, which go into automobiles. And so that's one of the sort of core industries of Germany. And when that first happened, a major German maker called Opel was about 2 weeks away from closing a production site in Germany. So those were very urgent things that happened. So in addition to rare earth magnets and critical minerals, we then also have now an experience story that is sort of slowly settling, but it's still uncertain where it's going. And so those are chips that go into automotives as well, but also machines. I think what's really interesting about the situation is that, and you said China applied them globally, but it really made a transatlantic issue out of a China issue that the Chinese didn't have to make it such. Because basically, when the Trump administration had issued its tariffs and various other measures against Beijing, it then issued these export controls on rare earths. It also did so on Europe and basically used the moment, used the opportunity to apply pressure to them as well. So now we have a shared goal or a shared problem at the very least that deserves a shared answer. And perhaps just a little note on the Trump-Xi summit. It has a lot of impact on Europe because the specific measures that were now postponed or that are being reduced also include measures on Europe for European companies. So yeah, for better or for worse, the transatlantic partnership, I think, is needed.
Zoltan, do you have a comment to add?
Yeah, so I wanted to drive it back to our report in which we have identified the rare earth issue as one of the key issues currently. And this issue is important for two reasons. A more general reason is that this issue actually demonstrates how similar some of the challenges are that the US and the EU are facing simultaneously from China, overcapacity, currency manipulation, forced technology transfer, and the export controls on rare earths. The more immediate reason for our focus on this is a imminent and critical challenge for both the United States and the EU since October 9th, as Mihail mentioned. So I wanted to thank Congressman Molinar for highlighting the fact that our report's recommendations feature our recommendation on rare earths as number one most important recommendation, because Val and I believe, based on our research, that Washington and Brussels must establish some kind of a standing US-EU critical minerals coordination platform in order to jointly manage supply chains, to reduce dependence on China, to strengthen resilience and align their industrial policies. We have also identified in our recommendation some existing capacities within the EU, namely rare earth separation plants in Estonia and Sweden, and nickel and cobalt recycling hubs in Finland and Germany, as facilities that we believe the US and the EU should cooperate on supporting and expanding. And recent weeks' developments really underline how important, this issue is. The Trump administration seems to be, facing this issue head on. They're doing, a number of different things already. First of all, you mentioned the Trump-Xi summit in Busan, South Korea, where, they had an agreement that China would pause the October 9th restrictions on the US and other countries for a year in exchange for certain export control concessions from the United States. So, the Trump administration is trying to approach this, through making peace with China on this and still being able to procure critical minerals from China. But President Trump has also signed critical minerals deals in recent weeks with Australia and Japan. And as recently as last Friday, President Trump met with the leaders of five Central Asian nations in the format that we call C5+1. And they made a couple of agreements with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan on critical minerals. But we believe that those efforts, while they're very positive, they're not enough. We strongly believe that the transatlantic allies, the United States and the EU, need to get together and cooperate in order to end their dependence on China for rare earths and critical minerals, and also develop homegrown and allied capacities to achieve what we call critical mineral security for themselves.
Thanks for that. I have been a bit surprised and encouraged to hear how many projects are coming online in Europe. I didn't realize that Europe was such a I mean, I've heard of multiple projects coming online, in France, for example, countries I did not realize had that capacity to do processing or other kinds of development. We are just about at time. So why don't we go to Michael? We'll go backwards, not Michael, Val, and then Michael, and then Jackie for any final comments you have to wrap us up. So Val, over to you, and then Michael, and then Jackie.
Well, thank you very much. So, maybe my final comment is really thanking you all, thanking you, Melanie, also for all your support during the writing of this report, and thanking all the institutions in the different capital cities that we met and shared their perspectives. So this was really something that we got the information from what's happening in the ground. So thank you to SRF too for supporting us in this initiative. I think that my final comment will be that maybe one of the findings of the paper too is that where we have seen more convergence in terms of policies, transatlantic convergence, but also convergence of member states with the European Commission policy on China, is where we see better relations of those countries with the United States. So I think that, good political relations are very important into having those joint initiatives. I think that all the laundry list that starts with the rare earth, but that we have for each of the areas going from trade to technology and to security that we have recommended in our report, they will never work out if there's no strong political will on both sides of the Atlantic to really focus on strengthening this important relationship that we sometimes overlook. We focus too much on trade, and we forget that the backbone of economic relations, of the transatlantic relations, is really foreign direct investments on both sides of the Atlantic. And sometimes we overlook this important element, but also the fact that relationships are based on values, standards, and cultural relationship transatlantically. So political will be my final comment in order to implement some of those recommendations, and also at the end of the day to increase the bargaining power of the transatlantic community and bring China to the table to find agreements on these important issues.
Thank you. Mike.
Maybe in closing, I'll say that I think as leaders in Brussels, but more importantly, leaders in Washington look towards Berlin or Germany as a partner on China, I think things are heading in the right direction, but I think they will also progress more slowly than perhaps one would wish or hope. The reason things are heading in the right direction is because institutions are being set up that will have staying power to deal with this issue. Everything from a National Security Council that Germany has for the very first time ever to this expert commission that I mentioned earlier. But the willingness to take some of the heat and some of the economic pain, I think, will be muted. And one of the reasons in particular is that Germany is heading into the third year of an economic recession. So I think politicians will have to thread a very thin line in becoming tougher on China while maintaining economic viability for their various industries. So that's perhaps my goodbye message with regard to Berlin.
Thank you. So Jackie, and then over to Zoltan as well for a very final.
Yeah, so just wanted to express my gratitude for inviting me to participate in the panel. It's been a great discussion, and thanks again for letting me take a peek at the report. My closing thought is, I want to see us move. I want the U.S. and Europe. I want us to see us move from shared analysis to actual concrete strategic coordination. And just to piggyback on what Zoltan had suggested on critical minerals, and I'm sorry that I didn't mention this before, the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council. It was our way of trying to, have conversations with the EU on these critical issues. I think critical minerals, rare earths is a perfect topic to have in that sort of for similar forum. It also helped coordinate us internally, that we brought together the State Department, Commerce and Trade to talk about these issues, because these are mammoth issues and it can't just be led by one agency. And I'd like to see that come back. And so I hope the Trump administration realizes that despite where we are on transatlantic relationships and where the mood music is overall, it's a moment of opportunity if we work together.
So to continue that line of thought from Jackie, we're actually recommending the resurrection or the revival of the Trade and Technology Council, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. We're recommending that to the Trump administration or any future administrations in Washington. We think it's a really important platform and channel to work on these issues together. The transatlantic partners, the United States and the EU, have had a difficult year. We have many differences. We had, disagreements on trade, which were settled in the trade deal in early August. We've had differences on Russia and Ukraine, but we've had a lot of conversations. There's been also a lot of convergence on those issues. But what we have to realize on both sides, both in the United States and in Europe, in our respective capitals, is that we are facing some of the exact same challenges from China: overcapacity, currency manipulation, rare earths, economic coercion, and the list is long, and we could continue that. I think we need to realize that they're not just the same challenges, but there are challenges that cannot really be faced alone, either by the United States or the EU or EU member states themselves. Our chances of tackling these challenges and pushing back against China's coercion are much higher if we work together. And we're encouraging both sides to open new channels and, as Jackie said, not just arrive at the same analysis, but also find ways to coordinate action.
So thank you all. And just to add one point to that, it's kind of the perfect timing to get something moving, because on the US side, finally, just now, we have people confirmed in the seats that would need to play a leading role on some of these mechanisms. I think from Europe, it might be easy to forget that some of those, the undersecretary positions, the assistant secretary positions, they've been vacant and policy's been almost exclusively run out of the White House. But once you start getting strong leaders in those positions in some of our relevant agencies, it creates more opportunity to have some of these mechanisms that I had found very beneficial in the previous administration. And with rare earths, there's a big opportunity to pick that up and do something transatlantically. So thank you all. These are really great points, and I really appreciated the opportunity to hear from you this morning. Really appreciate you for joining us. Thank you.